All right, thank you so much for the introduction. Just to check, can everyone see my screen and hear me? All right, perfect. All right, thank you all for coming. Today, I'll be presenting my paper titled Cross-Domain Gender Identification Using VR Tracking Data. And I presented this last year at IEEE ISMAR in Seattle. And my co-authors are Dr. Alec Moore, Nayan Chawla, and Dr. Ryan McMahon, who is with us here today. All right, so to start out with some introductory background information, we know that extended reality systems track motion data, and this has been found to be highly indicative of both personal identity and users' attributes. Prior researchers in this field have conducted machine learning experiments that have been task-specific and domain-specific. Our primary contribution is one of the first cross-domain investigations in which we conduct machine learning experiments trained on models in the assembly domain and tested on the gaming domain, and vice versa. And this allows us to make discoveries based on different data sets with different participant pools. Now, by nature of us conducting cross-domain experiments, we are using data sets with completely different participants, and thus we are unable to investigate personal identifiability. However, we have found that we can conduct investigation into users' attributes, and we selected gender as a research topic for various reasons, one of them being that prior researchers have found that males and females demonstrate significant differences that are pertinent to virtual reality, including but not limited to simulator sickness, color perception, wayfinding, spatial presence, and empathy. Identifying the gender of a VR user has various benefits, and one of these is providing customized experiences. So, for example, this may look like providing the navigation teleportation technique to minimize simulator sickness in women and increasing illumination to aid color perception in men. Our other contributions include an in-depth exploration of the effects of device combination and spatial representations on our machine learning model accuracies, and we make our code open source on GitHub for the sake of future researchers to replicate our work or build upon it. Now, for a quick overview of our related work, we see here that many researchers have investigated task-specific machine learning experiments, and this is when models are trained and tested on users performing the same task in the same domain. Many have also investigated domain-specific experiments in which models are trained and tested on different tasks from the same domain. At the very bottom here, we see our paper in which we conduct experiments that are cross-domain, which are trained on users performing different tasks from different domains. We also observe here that while many have investigated personal identifiability shown in the subject column, fewer have targeted identifying gender as the user attribute. And finally, we see that our in-depth device combination exploration builds upon an already rich body of work in the field. So our research questions are the following. We wish to understand how these factors affect gender identifiability. First of all, how do cross-domain experiments compare to domain-specific experiments, and is one more predictive than the other? Secondly, we wish to understand the effect of the training domain, and this suddenly becomes a pertinent question because now our training and testing domains are different and our subsets are split by domain for the sake of ecological validity. We wish to understand the effect of VR tracking device combinations, spatial representations, and machine learning algorithms used upon the accuracies, as well as find out which features are the most indicative for our models. Here, device combinations include the headset, left and right controllers, and spatial representations include position, quaternion, Euler, and 6D rotation representations. The algorithms we selected were k-nearest neighbors, random forest, and gradient boosting machines, and we selected these based on their high performance in similar works. For the assembly domain, we utilized the FAST dataset by Moore et al., and here users were guided by interaction cues to assemble two different tube structures shown here, structure A and structure B. This led to a very intuitive subset breakdown in which build A corresponded to subset A and build B to subset B. So the researchers collected data from the headset, right and left-hand controllers, as well as position and orientation data for each. The participant data available to us were that of 56 males and 50 females. For the gaming domain, we used the Who is Alex dataset by Rack et al. And here the researchers gathered data from users playing different levels from this popular game, Half-Life Alyx. Level 1 corresponded to subset A, and level 3 of the game corresponded to subset B. While the researchers collected data from many devices, we focused only on the headset and right and left-hand controllers for consistency with the FAST dataset. In addition, they collected position and quaternion data, which we then used to generate Euler and 60 representations, again for consistency. So the data available to us were that of 33 males and 30 females for subset A, and 34 males and 28 females for subset B. Now, before moving on, I wanted to quickly touch on rotation representations. The Euler and quaternion representations may look familiar because they're commonly used in our field, but the 60 representation may look new or be less familiar to you. So we selected the 60 representation as part of our investigation because prior work has shown that they are sometimes more indicative in deep learning contexts than Euler and quaternion. You can see here in the figure that there is a 4x4 transformation matrix, and the highlighted values are the 6 values used in order to create that 60 representation. Now, in order to prepare our data for the machine learning experiments, we had to pre-process it with this pipeline. We started out with the raw participant data collected at 90 frames per second, and then aggregated them into 1-second intervals. And then from there, we calculated 5 summary statistics for these intervals. These included the maximum, the median, minimum, mean, and standard deviation. We then used this to compute the n-dimensional vector, which is fed as the input to our machine learning models. And n is the product of the 5 statistics by the number of spatial features by the number of devices we are examining. So for a high-level overview of the specific experiments that we conducted, we examined both domain-specific and cross-domain gender identification for the purposes of having a baseline for comparison. We conducted 588 domain-specific experiments and 1,176 cross-domain experiments for a total of 1,764. This is also why we chose not to optimize hyperparameters for our research, as this would have led to a computational explosion in the number of experiments we would have had to conduct. So this is an area that we are actively working on for future work. Our domain-specific machine learning pipeline is the following. We start out with a subset of data, train one of our 3 models, and then we test it with the other subsets from within the same domain. We then collect our accuracy, F1, precision, and recall scores, which you can find in the supplemental materials of our paper. The cross-domain machine learning pipeline is very similar. We also start out with the subsets and train the 3 models like before, but this time we test it with a subset from the opposite domain. And in a similar manner, we gather the 4 evaluation metric scores in order to compare our results. So here we can take a look at the results of our experiments. The following tables are the accuracy scores for each kind of experiment, and they are presented in such a way that the 7 device combinations are the rows and the 7 spatial representations are the column. The legend at the bottom can be a helpful guide. And the color coding here corresponds to the accuracies of the scores, where if it is closer to 50%, they are red, and if they're closer to 100%, they're green, because this is a binary classification problem. So looking at the blue boxes here, we see that for the assembly domain, everything in the first 4 rows performs well because they are indicative features for gender identification. On the right here for the gaming domain, this is a subset of the previous features in which the headset and position are the most indicative of gender. So before moving on to our cross-domain results, I wanted to point out that the k-nearest neighbors model did not perform well in cross-domain experiments, as evidenced by all the red on this page. And this makes sense because k-nearest neighbors are intrinsically based upon distance calculations. So naturally, this does not translate well across domains. We see here that many of the scores hover around the 50% threshold, and some of them are even suboptimal, like 39% or 41%. So given this, we discourage researchers from using the k-nearest neighbors model in similar experiments in the future. Now onto our cross-domain results. We see that the models trained upon the assembly domain and testing on the gaming domain, shown on the left, shows a stark contrast in the effectiveness of using head position and those that do not. And similarly, on the right, with models trained on gaming and tested on assembly, we see a similar subset of features, although it is a slightly smaller box because the position and Euler spatial representation did not perform as well here. So these two tables help us understand two things about cross-domain gender identification. Firstly, that the training domain does make a difference in terms of accuracies of the scores, as well as the specific subsets of features that are indicative. We also observed that cross-domain gender identification is more challenging than domain-specific identification, as the lowest scores in the tables here are worse than the lowest scores in the domain-specific tables we looked at previously. So just to conclude and go over what our findings in our study were, first of all, we found that cross-domain gender identification is more challenging than domain-specific identification. And we also found that head position is extremely important for gender identification. And we conjectured that this has to do with head's y-axis correlating to the user's height. We found that the training domains do matter, and depending on what kind of results and experiments you're trying to conduct, it may be better to train upon the assembly domain, like our results evidenced. But for other types of experiments, it may be better to train upon the gaming domain, so the context matters very much. We also found that the k-nearest neighbors model for cross-domain experiments performs poorly, and this affects what models researchers choose in the future. Thank you for your time.